In spite of the fact that the human mind is widely regarded as one of evolution's most remarkable achievements, it is also prone to horrifying fancies. Throughout the centuries, the pages of history have sung about horrible tales of torture, human brutality, and the sadistic pleasure both individuals and groups of people gained from seeing others in excruciating anguish. This sadistic pleasure was derived from both witnessing others in excruciating suffering and from inflicting that agony on others. In this video, we will discover, if you dare, some of the most gruesome methods that individuals were put to death in ancient times. Crucifixion. From the ancient world to the modern, the crucifixion comes first on this gruesome order of events. This is something that was done in the ancient world as well as in the modern world, even up until the 20th century. The Assyrians and Babylonians were the first to utilize it, and they were followed by the Persians, Alexander the Great, and the Phoenicians, who were the first to utilize it in Rome in the 3rd century BC. The act of crucifixion consisted of the victim being nailed or fastened to a beam of wood, sometimes known as a cross. In order to support the weight of the individual, nails were driven through the bones located below the wrists. Only the median nerve was struck, which would cause the fingers to become rigid and the hands to flex downward in a painful contracture. This was a brilliant location because it avoided hitting any important blood vessels. Once the legs became too weak to support the body, the arms were forced to do so, in order to keep the body upright, which resulted in the shoulders being ripped out of their sockets. The feet were nailed to the vertical part of the cross. After the elbows and wrists, the length of the arms continued to increase, reaching a total of several inches. At this point, the chest had to support the weight of the body, which resulted in difficulties breathing and ultimately death from suffocation. Rat torture. Eaten alive. In spite of the fact that they appear to be having a good time in the video above, rats are routinely subjected to cruel and unusual punishments, which ranks among the worst possible ways to die. The problem with rats is that they can chew right through almost anything. As a result, it should not come as much of a surprise that ancient peoples used them as instruments of torture in their societies. In most cases, a victim would have a little cage pressed up against their abdomen, and inside of that cage would be a rat. The rat was disturbed because the cage was heated from the outside by either a candle, a flaming stick, or hot coals, and this caused the cage to be heated. Therefore, how could it possibly get away? It did this by digging its claws into the only available soft surface, which was human skin. In a relatively short amount of time, the rat would chew its way into the victim's bowels, causing the individual to experience excruciating pain in the process. This method was quite successful in extracting information from detainees and also played on their psyches, which added a psychological dimension to the act of torturing them. The rack. Stretching the body. The rack was yet another instrument of torture that gained a terrible reputation in ancient times. It consisted of a table, which was often made of wood, and had axles and levers at both ends of it. After the victim was made to lie down against their will, leather straps or belts were used to bind their wrists and heels. The axles were wrapped with chains or ropes that were attached to the straps and wound around them. The torturers would then slowly push the levers, which would cause the axles to revolve and build tension in the chains. This might be done by one or several torturers. This resulted in the straps rubbing on the prisoner's flesh, which eventually stretched their body in an outward direction. It is difficult to fathom the internal physical upheaval that a person would have through. Vertebrae would have grown, joints, muscles, and tendons would have given way, posture would have shifted, the rib cage would have put pressure on the lungs, bones would have fractured, nerve endings would have been exposed, the anguish would have been close to incomprehensible. They were given an additional challenge by being placed on barbed axles, which tore the flesh off their backs. This was a reward for those who were especially tough. Keel hauling. Dragged under. The Dutch verb gehalen, from which this name is derived, means to drag along the keel, which is precisely what the technique of torture described here did. The sailor was disrobed, bound, and then hung from the ship's mast by a rope, while having weights or chains affixed to their legs. Once the sailor was freed, the rope was looped underneath the ship, and they were dragged under the keel. The number of fatalities was quite close to 100%. Even if the person did not die, they would have suffered serious head trauma from repeatedly hitting their head against the keel as well as extensive lacerations from the barnacles and other forms of aquatic growth that were present on the hull of the vessel. Even if they managed to avoid being killed and were brought back on board, it is likely that wound infections would cause them to pass away. The wheel a severe bashing. The next method is one that can only be described as excruciatingly painful. The wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, the Catherine wheel, or the execution wheel, this cruel device, which was employed widely throughout the ancient world, was reserved only for use in public executions. There are a few distinct iterations of this procedure, but in general, the detainee was restrained by being chained to a massive wooden wheel with spokes. The purpose was not to kill them, but rather to severely mutilate them, and the executioner would begin by shattering the leg bones, and then work their way up to the head. They would accomplish this by bludgeoning the victim to the point of near death with an iron bar, crushing all of their bones, and beating them to a pulp in the process. When everything was done, the horribly maimed prisoner would be moved on the wheel, such that their heels would come together at the back of their neck. This would be the final stage of the process. They were left in that position to bleed to death, before being abandoned. Impalement pierced straight through. Impalement, which can be described as a gruesomely horrific process, comes in at the number 5 spot on our list. This ancient kind of cruelty was routinely employed by a great number of civilizations and cultures. It consisted of impaling the victim with a long, sharp, and frequently greased stake, with the purpose of carrying out a capital sentence, putting down rebellions, correcting deserters, or eliminating military disobedience during times of war. Both the longitudinal and transversal approaches were used to carry out this strategy. For the longitudinal measurement, the subject was positioned such that they were looking down at the spike, which was put about halfway up their posterior privates. The spike would run them through as gravity took hold of them, avoiding important organs, and emerging through the skin of the victim's shoulder or neck. It is possible for a person to live through this for several days. When performing a transversal, the stake was instead driven through the body of the victim, either from front to back or vice versa, depending on the desired effect. Impalement can also take the form of gaunching, in which the victim is flung upon metal spikes, hooks, or rods, and is either left there to die, or is subjected to additional agony by the person carrying out the sentence. Blood eagle giving the victim wings. Welcome to the most barbarous way to die in the ancient world. The practice of the blood eagle. If the 6 other ways to die in the ancient world have not yet made you feel queasy, in spite of the fact that it is the subject of much controversy as to whether or not this type of torture actually existed in the real world, or was merely an invention of the written word, one thing is for certain: it was conceived by an extremely disturbed mind. The rite of the blood eagle was first referenced in the late poetry of the Skalds. The victim would be forced to lie on their stomach, while their back was cut open, their ribs would be separated from their spine, and their lungs would be pushed out the incision to produce a pair of gory wings. The victim would be kept alive through this process. However, if the Viking sagas are to be believed, this method has certainly earned its place as one of the most gruesome, excruciating, and outright horrifying ways to end one's life. It is difficult to imagine anyone remaining conscious long enough for this to be accomplished. Molten gold scorched from the inside. The seemingly impossible method of execution that involves sipping molten gold has earned the number 3 slot on our list. It is possible that this was carried out more frequently than is reported, particularly by the Romans and the Spanish Inquisition, who lived on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The method is rather straightforward. The victim would first be bound, then their lips would be forced open, and then heated gold would be poured down their throat. As a direct consequence of this, serious damage would be caused to distant organs, as well as blistering of the lungs, which would finally result in an instantaneous death. Flaying skinned alive. The following form of torture is almost as bad as the one described before, due to the sadistic way in which it is carried out. Due to the lengthy nature of the procedure, flaying, also known as skinning, was likely the most agonizing means of death used in the ancient world. The victim was first disrobed, and then their hands and feet were bound to prevent them from moving in any direction. After this, the executioner would begin to peel away the individual's skin with a sharp blade, typically beginning with the head, because this location would cause the victim the greatest pain due to the fact that they were still aware during the process. In certain cases, sections of the person's body were even cooked, in order to make the skin more pliable and simpler to remove. This was done so that the skin could be more easily removed. There were a number of different ways that someone could pass away as a result of flaying, including shock, the loss of blood or fluids, hypothermia, or infection. Additionally, the time of death could be anywhere from a few hours to a few days, depending on the circumstances. A flayed body was a message. In medieval times, it was an eloquent canvas on which the secular authorities' punishment could be inscribed. Despite the fact that it was deemed extremely rare at the time, the Roman candle practice of lighting oneself on fire with a Roman candle ranked first among all other inhumane ways people were put to death in ancient times. This is chilling on multiple levels, whether one considers the method of death in and of itself, or the executioner who gave the order. Nero, the Emperor of Rome, is considered to be one of the most despicable and psychotic figures in world history. History is replete with vicious and psychopathic figures. He had such a deep-seated hatred for Christians that he would use them as human lamps, often known as torches, at his garden parties. The victims were first bound, and then nailed to the tops of long stakes. Following that, a combustible substance was poured over them, just before they were set ablaze. The fire was intentionally lit at their feet, to make their anguish last longer. Whether the Christians had participated in an uprising against the state, this was a horrible way to deal with the situation. It is a reflection of how brutal punishments were in ancient times, and how they were often created out of man's wicked ego and thirst to rule what he perceived to be a lower population. It also shows how these punishments were typically carried out. We hope you like this video. Subscribe to the channel if you are a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.